Thank you for downloading this podcast from the Forum for Philosophy. Subscribe for weekly discussions of science, culture, politics, and the arts from a philosophical perspective. The Forum is a non-profit organisation, and our events are free and open to all. You can support our work via our website and Facebook page.
So tonight we'll be joining hands and invoking spirits, or else standy shooing them away with a robust dose of reason. This event is our Halloween special, but it's also timely in other ways, in an age of uncertainty about the status of truth and disillusionment with conventional modes of political and social organisation. Perhaps we're seeing a resurgence of alternative modes of knowledge and being. And that is an important question for philosophy too, which so often presents itself as being founded on logic and rationality. But even the most rigorous of us must concede that the world can be a strange place, probably particularly on December the 12th, after we've had an election. So how does philosophy contend with the mysterious and the inexplicable? That's going to be one of our questions. Let me introduce you to our panel. Lauren Kassell is Professor of History of Science and Medicine. She works in early modern medicine and the occult sciences at the University of Cambridge. She's director of the Casebooks Project, which archives the work of early modern astrologers Simon Foreman and Richard Napier, who produced one of the largest surviving sets of medical records in history. She's the author of Medicine Magic in Elizabethan London, and also a historical consultant on a video game called Astrologaster, which you can all go look up immediately. Richard Pettigrew is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bristol, with particular interests in formal epistemology and the philosophy of mathematics, probability, rationality, and logic, and also, interestingly, I think, philosophy of religion. He's the writer of Accuracy and the Laws of Credence, and more generally, he's also written about universities. Who are universities for? And Nisha Ramayya is a poet and lecturer in creative writing at Queen Mary University of London. She's published several pamphlets. Her book, States of Body, glorious. It's outside. You can go buy copies, and I think Nisha might be available to sign them too. States of the Body, produced by Love, is published by Ignota, and Ignota is a new press that publishes at the intersection of technology, myth-making, and magic, focusing on work that reimagines and re-enchants the world around us. Who doesn't need that right now? Okay, so I'm going to talk to our panellists. We're going to chat between ourselves too, and very shortly we'll open up to the floor. So do dazzle us with brilliant questions and fox us with your problems, which often happens at forum events. So we'll turn over to you quite soon. I'm going to pose an introductory question to each of our speakers. And Lauren, I wanted to start with you, because it makes sense to start with the history of the occult. And your research is deeply rational and scholarly. So what is it about this early modern history of the occult that warrants the attention of a deeply rational and scholarly scholar?
Right. Thank you very much. My research has never before been called scholarly and rational because it wasn't in doubt. Thank you. Do you want me to? Should I start by saying what the occult is?
Yeah, that would be great.
Right? So, my expertise is on the period roughly 1500 to 1700. You can't understand that period without knowing what happened before and what happened after. So the conventional way to begin to define the occult is to go back to Aristotle. I won't spend very long with Aristotle, but for Aristotle, everything had properties. Form and matter had properties which were either manifest or hidden. And if you think about what we would call a magnet, the manifest properties of a magnet is it's cold and dry, hard as well, but cold and dry are its qualities, but it has this power to draw metals towards it. That's occult. You cannot see that. You can't identify the elemental qualities that go with that hidden power. So that's a very physical definition of the occult. And much of what I do when I study the occult is take the physics of the occult very seriously. But it also meant other things, and it accrued these different values over the centuries, and in some cases one was more at play than the other. So the second way of understanding how the occult was defined is that it was knowledge of how to understand and manipulate these hidden powers. And so that knowledge was often represented as secret knowledge. And that's why when we think about the occult, we often think of it as this secret thing. Right? So the what it is the knowledge of and the way that knowledge is communicated go together with this kind of witchy ethos occult thing that we're talking about today. And the third way that the occult is often understood is by critics of the occult who say something is occult, which means it's not rational. And this pairing of the rational and the irrational is at the heart of what we're trying to talk about today. So this pairing, these two sides of the same coin with the occult and the natural being related things, is something that has this huge history. And so I've always studied the occult because I am interested in the things that challenge us to our own sense that what we're dealing with and what we're living in is a rational world. And so more particularly, I'm interested in looking at the occult from the point of view particularly of practitioners, that is, people who mastered astrology, alchemy, and various forms of magic. And these are all hugely complicated traditions, some of which overlap at various times. But that, I think, is enough of a beginning of a definition.
Yeah. And when you're looking at these materials, which sound totally fantastic and fantastically interesting, why don't you give me a sense of what you are looking at? What is the evidence? What's the paper trail of these traditions?
So they all have different paper trails. So, for instance, astrology is this hugely long tradition, dates back before the ancient Greeks. They systematized it, and obviously it continues to the present day, and it's had various ruptures along the way. To study astrology, you often use manuals or almanacs or astronomical treatises. Astrology and astronomy are the same thing for much of this era. Astronomy is the observation and the mathematical knowledge of the movements of the heavens, and astrology is the understanding of their effects on Earth. So they're inseparable. So you have the manuals, you have philosophical treatises that are scholarly. They're explaining how the astrology works. But you also have almanacs, which individuals used or annotated. And then we have what I've spent the decade working on, these practice notebooks, these case books of these astrologer physicians, where you see them day by day, moment by moment, using astrological techniques to guide their patients in understanding what has caused their illnesses and prescribing what they can do to help with them. So astrology is really evident, right? You need to do your computations, and so it leaves this huge paper trail, which is lovely, if maddeningly messy. You can Google Casebooks Project, and you can see there are these horrendous manuscripts that we've digitized. But alchemy, by definition, is hidden. Right? You're only supposed to learn it from a person. You're not supposed to write it down. And if you write it down, bad things will happen. But we have thousands of alchemical manuscripts and thousands of printed alchemical works, all of which say, I'm the first person to tell you how really to do this. And they're full of duplicity. When they say 40, they mean 4. When they say the queen, they mean silver. So they're all coded in this way. So the writing is opposite, right? Astrology it says what it means. Alchemy does not say what it means. And some people practice both. Magic is a whole other mess. There are many different traditions of magic, but a lot of it is in the form of prayers, and here you have to take the writing as a physical act, right? So the textual and the practical cease to be things that are in contrast to each other. And by looking at the magical manuscripts, you are seeing people more often than not enacting a kind of magical practice, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally does. And it makes me wonder what questions you ask when you're looking at that material, because when I listen to you talk about it, it seems to me you're not looking back on that material as the remnant or the evidence of quaint folk tradition, superstitious people. You're looking at it because you believe that it served a purpose. Do you have a sense of what those purposes might have been?
Yeah, I look at it as though it serves a purpose. I also, sometimes, as do other historians of magic and the occult in all its forms, they also take the word of the critics of the occult, because you do have to remember that not everyone was leaving some traces in the historical record. So through the critics or through court records where occasionally people are prosecuted, you can get at a kind of check on what you're finding in the lovely manuscripts. Even if they're scruffy and horrible, they're still lovely in a certain way. So what I'm looking for is what people are doing kind of day by day, their kind of everyday practices, and what I'm resisting answering what I'm looking for, because what I'm not looking for, there's an argument which says people in the past used magic because they couldn't control their lives. So they didn't have insurance, which is a safety net. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have a rational way of deciding what they were going to do next. We didn't have population as a metric in this era, right? So that is what I am resisting. I refuse to say the people in the past were anxious and therefore they consulted astrologers. I think that is extremely demeaning of those people, which is not to say that it's not possible that they were anxious, but that they did things that were really rational, or our starting point has to be to presume that they were doing things that made perfect sense to them, and at the same time that they accepted, just as we accept, that it might not work, but we're going to try it. And so that it's almost like I have little rules for myself, which I've never thought to write down, about how it is that I allow myself to try to understand what it is that I'm looking at in these practitioners and their clients in the past. It's got to be taking the plausibility and the credibility of these activities, and that's a starting point, and appreciating that it's a really different world back then, but there are moments of familiarity and how you play with those things. So that's why I've allowed a lot of play in the research. Yeah. We've not just done the video game, but we've made videos and we've done little animated films. We've done all sorts of things to try to tease out the tensions between what is it.
Yeah. Familiarity is a very interesting term, because, forgive me for prodding further, but just because your research just sounds like, I just imagine you in turning dusty pages of astrological diagrams and, breaking seals and then plumes of smoke, that sort of thing. Don't disillusion me of that, what I'm imagining. But of that spectrum of things that might be familiar and things that must seem utterly mystifying, can you give us a sense of what you're encountering? What's been familiar and what's been utterly mystifying?
I don't know. So I'm so close to it now. I mean, where you get the familiarity is, or where I find it most difficult to resist the distance I wish to impose, is there's a lot of emotion in the records these are the astrological records that I'm talking about. There's a huge amount of emotion in these records. There are. I was looking at a case with some students yesterday of a woman whose husband was beating her. He was trampling on her chest, and you read through this, and it's very hard not to just see how horrible, and they're not written out as full narratives. These are in the moment, so they're often list-like: black, blue, chest, belly, legs. I mean, it's almost poetic. And we've played with the you can take just phrases from these, and you have a whole person's, and they're sort of writerly games, tell a whole person's story in one sentence. We have real people's whole stories in one sentence or one series of phrases in these records. The most alienating moments, actually, I have been looking at manuscripts of ritual magic, where you could use magic to heal, and you could use magic to harm. And you do see people who say, I tried to kill him with this recipe, right? And however remote we consider these texts, that watching somebody on a page express a wish to kill somebody with a set of words and procedures makes you stop. Right, and that's where, when I had a series of ritual magic texts. There's a modern appetite for these. They're reprinted. You can, they're in the British Library, but you can also, order up from Amazon various texts of ritual magic. And there was a point when I had to remove them to the room furthest from my bedroom in my house.
Really?
And I knew that didn't make any sense, but these are scary, horrible texts. And so there I was, kind of not quite sure how I felt about that. I felt bad about I felt they were dangerous. I still feel they're dangerous, because it's within them is the possibility of using your will to harm another person. I don't mind the healing parts. Mm-hmm. It's not the powers that I mind, it's the intent that I haven't thought about this very much before, but I did know that I'd moved them away.
Yeah, that's so interesting and so intelligent, I think, as well. Thank you so much. Nisha and Richard, I wondered if you wanted to comment on what the fascinating things that Lawrence has been telling us.
Well, one thing I was going to ask is, this came up in what you were saying, and it came up when I was sort of reading about this and trying to figure out myself what the occult was, and esotericism, and all these things, and trying to kind of get a handle on it, that they look very continuous with science, with what we kind of look at. So I was wondering, is this term, the occult, used essentially by people outside as a critique of practices that are now thought, or were at the time it was used, thought to not be rational or not? Because the sort of things that you're talking about, as you were saying, was, it sounds like people just doing their best with the evidence available to them, with the theories that they had best at their disposal, to do the best job at kind of controlling bits of the world, figuring out bits of the world, changing it. So I suppose my question is, was there really a distinction at the time people were doing these things between someone who thought of themselves as pursuing something more like science and someone doing something else, or is this more kind of done in retrospect?
No, both. Right. So they're different. I'm trying to work out which. So there are always people who consider themselves, or not always, but in medieval and early modern Europe, there are people who consider themselves occult philosophers of a certain sort, which means they're natural philosophers, but they have a particular knowledge of the hidden workings of nature. These people are not necessarily astrologers, alchemists, or magicians. Those are very specific traditions. You can understand the physics without invoking the powers, though astrology is a little bit more like understanding than invoking. But as much as there are occult philosophers, there are people who are theologians usually, who are interested in drawing the lines between what is natural, what is unnatural. Unnatural is the area between the natural and the supernatural that is inhabited by demons, good demons and bad demons. And what the theologians are interested in is working out where the natural stops and the unnatural starts, and where the unnatural stops and the supernatural starts. Because if you find yourself traversing on the part that means you're in discourse with demons, you are doing something theologically bad, even if you think those demons are angels. And there are people who did that. They had conversations with angels, and they often had conversations accidentally or deliberately with demons. And so these theologians, who are often called demonologists, they're drawing the lines between what is natural, unnatural, and supernatural, and they're labeling the people in a bad way. It's that othering term. You are occult or you are superstitious. So it goes both ways. And then in the 17th century in particular, experimental philosophy begins to interrogate the hidden workings of nature. And this is hugely important in the development of science, what we call the scientific revolution, with always scare quotes around it. And there they push the line as far into the supernatural as they can. So they naturalize everything. They naturalize spirits. They write natural histories of spirits. They interrogate or torture the hidden workings of nature. And so they are very close to scientists. We don't have scientists yet, but they're experimental philosophers who, gravity, Newton's great study of gravity. Gravity is action at a distance. What is action at a distance? It's what the magnet is doing. It is occult. But that, without Newton, we don't have science.
Yeah.
Can't believe I just said that.
That's a great and very persuasive example. Nisha, did you want to respond?
Yeah. Well, I just had. I could ask so many questions. Your research sounds fascinating. I was thinking about what you were saying about like everyday practices, and I was wondering maybe if you could talk about who had access to some of to occult knowledges and powers and practices, and if because for some of these practices you would need to be literate for one, and where the line might be between folk practices where you might not need to be literate and some of these occult practices where you might need to be taught or initiated. So something like social history.
Yeah, so who has access to them? So one of the things that happens in the centuries that I study is that natural knowledge, for lack of a better term, becomes articulated and debated by a much wider community. And part of those debates are about where does this knowledge come from? Does it come from experience or does it come from books? And if it comes from books, are these the books from ancient Greece that have been passed down and corrupted along the way? Or is it, for instance, is the best healing knowledge from the ancient doctors, or is it from the wise woman around the corner? And so the conversation opens up. And the experiment is actually a recipe, right? Recipes, whether they're written down or communicated otherwise, become a kind of centerpiece of how you know something. You test it, or you make it, and you do it. And so there's a way that my answer to your question has just brought the old women into the conversation while denigrating them. And actually, part of what's interesting is while looking at all of these sources, which are the only sources we have, you're always looking for the voices that are missing. And you're always allowing for the fact that there are people who are in the background, whether it's in the household. You have family members. This is often where you find women's influence, but it's not explicitly written down, or at least not by those women. And we do have some literate women. The literate women are elite women, so then you end up with some other issues. So it's always an attempt, my research is always an attempt to bring other voices in, but you often have to do it tangentially and recognize that the value of what they knew was itself being questioned throughout the period.
That's so interesting. Thank you, Richard. Can I draw you in?
Sure.
How confident are philosophers, or is philosophy, of the distinctions between the rational, the irrational, and the non-rational?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as confident as philosophers are, I mean, individually, philosophers are overconfident usually, but as a discipline, certainly split. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. So there's this sort of question about what exactly rationality is, sort of what sort of thing would, or what sort of standards do you hold it to? And then the second thing is the kind of substantive questions. And then once you've set those standards, what in particular meets those sort of standards? So on the question about what the standards should even be, there's a sort of, well, just to illustrate one of the distinctions, which I think comes in very much when it comes to beliefs in the occult or religious beliefs or beliefs about science or beliefs in your daily life, is a difference between sort of believing just as much as the evidence allows you and no more, versus sort of just trying to get at the truth. Now, you might think, well, look, those two things are sort of, surely they've got to go hand in hand, because the thing that the way of believing that will get you as close to the truth as you can is going to be essentially just, matching up with the evidence or believing in line with the evidence and no further than that. But there's this sort of famous debate back in the 19th century between W.K. Clifford and William James about in what circumstances could that actually, the match between those two things actually break down? And they're particularly interested in mystical belief or religious belief in that context. Because James's point is, you could never get to a religious belief. According to James, he thinks that other philosophers are going to deny this particular claim, but he thinks you'll never be able to get to a religious belief, or perhaps in our context, a belief in the occult, if all you can do is pay attention to the evidence. If that's the only thing, if you can never kind of take a leap beyond what the evidence gives you, you can never come to some sort of belief in a religious sort of proposition. And that's problematic for James, because he thinks, look, these things are possibly true. There could be this sort of mechanism in the hidden mechanism in the occult. And if it's the case that it's just not permissible for me ever to believe beyond my evidence, then that's a truth that I've got to miss out on. And he thinks that's not really acceptable. He thinks you can't really have an account of rationality where there's certain things that could be true, but rationality you could never possibly get to a situation where you could come to believe it. So that's just one sort of example of a case where even what the standard of rationality is can be different. On the one hand, is it rationality just says that you should believe only in line with your evidence, or should you also be able to sort of take leaps of faith in some sense, and that still be okay? James talks about them in terms of kind of taking epistemic risks, or kind of where epistemic here just means kind of your knowledge. So taking risks in your beliefs that may be true, but you're going beyond your evidence. That's why it's a risky sort of enterprise. So I think there's that sort of thing, and then there's a whole. I mean, particularly since we're at the LSE, where Karl Popper was sort of in the philosophy department. There's also this debate then within, once you've got your standard of rationality in place, asking, in particular, what principles of kind of good reasoning are there that allow us to match up with rationality. And so usually one thing that we standardly do is we kind of take a body of evidence from the past that we've observed, and we kind of extrapolate on the basis of that to the future. So why do I think the sun's going to rise tomorrow? Well, it's risen all these other times in the past. And I mean, famously, the reason I bring up Popper is that famously kind of him and maybe 2 other people out in the world have thought that that's not rational, that's a non-rational way of forming beliefs. So there's that sort of debate as well. I mean, in philosophy, of course, you're going to find debates on just about every topic. So the nature of rationality is definitely one that's where there's some controversy. But I think another place where there's controversy is kind of what we're really trying to use the concept of rationality for. Yeah. Because there's a kind of a very good and reasonable critique of the concept that essentially it's been a sort of imperialist strategy, or a strategy of oppression to silence certain voices, or to sort of mark off one half of the world as not worth listening to, or not one half of the world, or just one group of people in your society is not worth listening to, the irrational people. So it's kind of used as a stick to beat people with. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, my own research is kind of in rationality, and so I sort of want to be able to still use the concept, but in a way that doesn't have that. So then the question is, so what is this other notion of rationality out there that isn't just a sort of a tool of oppression? And I think the best way to think about it, and I think it comes back very much to what Lauren was talking about, is that the best way to see rationality is just, what it means for someone to be rational is just, are they doing the best they can do from their own internal standpoint at getting at the thing that they want to get at? So if it's believing, then you want to get at truths. So are you doing the best thing from your own point of view? And that's why, this point about we mustn't look back on, figures in the sort of 15th, 16th, 17th century and think, well, look, we believe all these things that from our current point of view just look ridiculous. They thought there were these strange forces in the stars that were drawing all the kind of inert matter on the earth towards them or something. Yeah, it does look sort of ridiculous when looked back on from our point of view. But of course, from their point of view, they were doing the best they could within the limits that they had to get at it. So I think there is this notion of rationality that doesn't require you to sort of to use it just as this critique tool. I mean, you might still think, why are we using this concept to judge people with? Well, in a way, I think there's quite a good answer to that. The answer is the reason we think about this is kind of an engineering project. You're trying to make yourself the best belief-forming thing that you can be. So when we sort of study rationality, we're trying to kind of engineer our own minds, our own brains, or our ways of thinking, so that they're going to end up giving us these kind of most... so it's not really a concept, I would say, that we use to sort of judge other people and sort of pick on other people and put them into institutions or to criticise them or to silence them, but rather a concept we can use to improve ourselves in this thing that we're trying to do, trying to get true beliefs.
Yeah, I was going to ask you almost exactly that. How inconvenient that you got to it. Obviously, some psychic message came to you, but just that there is a way in which that kind of continuing belief in the occult could, in one way, be taken as the mark of the failure of a philosophical project, right? And one that endangers a philosophical project, or you can think of it as a kind of way in which it punctures the confidence of philosophy in improving ways. And it seems to me you're suggesting the latter. But I wonder what kind of evidence it would take to be able to persuade a philosopher to believe in the occult. What is the standard of evidence?
I mean...
like something that goes bump in the night and leaves a message on Descartes' blackboard. What is it?
Well, so there's some interesting arguments here about once you've got yourself to thinking so I suppose maybe the thing to say is what would count as a standard of evidence for someone depends on the beliefs they come to it with. So Hume makes this point when he's talking about miracles and sort of what you'd have to see, what you'd have to experience in the world in order to come to believe in God. Well, if you're really strongly convinced that there's no God, actually it may even be impossible, because just everything you could possibly see, the likelihood of it happening because God did it is just so much less than the likelihood of it happening just due to some unseen but entirely natural process. And so I think you could be in a position where you're sort of reasoning, and I suppose this is what people mean by being open-minded, is that you're sort of making it yourself open to the possibility of evidence. But I think there's this, and there's something that kind of comes up in my research again and again and again, that I'm very against the idea that there's some sort of just standard of evidential support that a bit of evidence can give to something, so that for every one of us, if we saw the same bit of evidence, we'd end up with the same beliefs. We come at evidence, we come at the world, we come to experience the world just laden up with beliefs. And those beliefs determine how we take bodies of evidence on. So someone who's kind of reasonably inclined towards religious beliefs or something, of course, is going to take a piece of evidence that looks a bit outside the standard scientific kind of theories as being something that shifts them quite a bit towards believing in whatever, religion or the mysterious forces. If they're like just a fully confirmed scientist, then, scientist in the sense of scientism, in the sense of entirely materialist and naturalist, then it's going to take just... Perhaps it's impossible to ever get to a point of evidence.
I take that to mean that you can't peer review a ghost, and that may well be the case. But these are the most fiendish questions ever. There's obviously some devil in me, but I want to ask you also the inverse, because so the opposite of how do you persuade? How does a ghost persuade a philosopher that they exist? Is how does a philosopher persuade a ghost that they don't exist? So how does a philosopher go about dissuading someone of occult belief? What's the standard of evidence there?
Yeah, good. I mean, how does a philosopher end up persuading anybody of anything occult or otherwise? I mean, I think that there's one thing you could say. Because the sort of evidence, I had an experience when I was a child. I was at a sleepover at a friend's house, and
I love these stories.
Yeah, given the topic, I had something like this. It still freaks me out, this experience. So, staying at this friend's house, and we were sort of, we'd meant to have gone to bed, but we were sort of up chatting, and we knew that only his mum was in the house. His dad was away somewhere. We knew that, and we saw two, in the shadow kind of the light cast by the bathroom light, two people go past towards the bathroom. But there was nobody else. We knew that for sure. There was nobody else. It wasn't a big house. And it's still sort of, I find it very strange. I wasn't at that time anyway inclined towards believing in ghosts. I'm not now in any way inclined towards believing in ghosts, but I still can't fit that experience in. We both saw it, so it wasn't like, this was a mass hallucination, but it certainly wasn't just some sort of bizarre play of the light just on me. It was just... Anyway, so how do you persuade someone? Again, so how did I persuade myself or what have you not to sort of believe in ghosts on the basis of that? One thing is kind of unifying power. I think... One thing, and you might wonder why we're so drawn to theories that have great unifying power, but suppose we are, and certainly the way science goes, or at least the way science has gone in the 20th, 21st century, is to sort of towards grand unified theories of everything that you can, that there is, not just in our kind of local little bit of the universe, but actually across the entire vast expanse of the universe. It just turns out that's not going to fit in. It's got to be a blip. There's no unifying theory that both accounts for everything else I've experienced, everything else I've read, and everything else I've learned from people and so on, but that also fits this experience into it as anything other than just a mistake. There's just no real room for it. And I suppose the question is, well, sure, there's room for it. It's just that was just a ghost. And you saw it, and they exist, and that's it. Why not just think that? But as well as this unifying power, we also have this kind of this Occam's razor, this sort of don't posit things, don't believe in things beyond what you absolutely need to. And that would be the standard way, I guess, for philosophers to convince someone that something like a ghost didn't exist, that or to persuade the ghost that it didn't exist, and it sort of goes on a puff of smoke. That you just it's a large extra thing to add into your kind of your inventory of the world. It's a big one. It's not just it's like adding an extra fundamental particle or an extra force in the universe or something to put in ghosts. And so it's got to really have a lot of extra power, scientific power, predictive power, explanatory power, before it can really, earn its keep in our scientific theories. And it just doesn't. One experience when I was 11 years old, it's not really enough for me. And of course, everyone knows people who also claim they've seen ghosts as well. So, I'm sure there's going to be.
Gosh, that was a good answer. Everybody tweet Richard your ghost stories. So we can do Lauren and Nisha have responses? You do?
Well, yeah, I had a question. I appreciate what you were saying about what happens when you try to kind of define what's irrational and what's rational in these categories, and how they can be used. They have been used for kind of in terms of imperialism and colonialism, and to suppress different forms of knowledge. And I think you're very sympathetic to these different ways of thinking. But I also was thinking about the visual metaphors and ways that you're describing the experiences in terms of seeing a ghost. So that was your experience. It was, and there's this idea of seeing as believing, and to know it, you have to be able to, like, you get the written message, or this kind of like the emphasis on the visual which I think is something to do with European and Christian cultures, especially. And like in my own kind of research, I've been thinking lots about one of the Sanskrit words for revelation. So revelation is, in English, it's that which has been seen or revealed. It's a visual. In Sanskrit, it's shruti, which is that which has been heard. And so I was just wondering, like, if you could speak to ways of understanding that aren't about seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's. So no, I suppose there's. So I suppose the things that, say, a philosopher or might say about seeing, they might also say about hearing, given that that they're both sort of sensory experiences, and I would also sort of say about touch and smell and taste as well. So they think sensory sort of things. I mean, often not for good reasons, but philosophers are kind of just bound up together. So sort of philosophers in the kind of analytic tradition are sort of bound up together. But one sort of thing that, as you were saying, either hearing or kind of revelation, I think that is another sort of thing which is quite different and has got quite a lot of attention from, or is starting to get quite a lot of attention recently, is kind of experiences that are not from any of the senses, but somehow seem to come from inside, which is, I don't know if that was exactly what you're meaning by revelation, but that's, sometimes people talk about revelations as not being sort of a vision necessarily, or hearing the voice of a religious voice, but sort of something that comes inside. And I think that's a really interesting way of acquiring knowledge, which has the area that's come from, interestingly, in philosophy recently is through hallucinogenics, particularly. So actually not sort of, I mean, there is actually a whole body of work on kind of religious revelation, but there is this question about because people often talk, coming out of hallucinogenic states, of kind of revelations, of learning things that they just didn't think they could learn before. And it's interesting, one really interesting thing I found about that is they also don't feel that the knowledge, and this comes back to your thing about oppressing or silencing different forms of knowledge, is the knowledge isn't something they feel they can express fully, at least, in words. So you sort of say, well, what's this thing that you learned? And they say, well, I can roughly sort of gesture at it by saying it's some sort of realization that there's a certain oneness or unity about the universe and that things are connected, and also I've kind of realized my own insignificance in it, and that, I'm kind of just a part of it. But they say, I mean, I'm saying all these things, but basically they don't come close to what I really experience. And I'm guessing that's kind of what some of revelation is like as well. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting work to do about what sort of evidence that gives us, and do we have such a thing as knowledge that can't be expressed, that you could never possibly express in words? You could only ever get it by having the experience. So, yeah.
Lauren, did you have a no?
Of course I have questions. I was really interested in. Well, it seemed to me a lot of slippage in what you were saying between the occult, the irrational, and the religious. And rather than ask you to define all of these terms, I I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the word belief. So I don't think I use, one of my words I don't use, partly because the best teacher I ever had was an anthropologist who said only the believer believes, the non-believer believes. Only the non-believer believes, the believer believes, right? Which it's a way of saying that somebody who believes doesn't know. We know, and that person doesn't know. And so I always use the word know, and probably there's some subtlety lost to what I have to say because I use one word instead of two. And two words are usually better because they have different subtleties to their meanings. But belief in your explanations was doing a huge amount of work. So can you say a bit more about that?
So it's supposed to do a lot of work by not doing any work. But so the point is meant to be that belief is just an entirely neutral description of someone who... people often say, actually, what any normal person would say is thinks. Philosophers have this thing about talking about such and such, believes it's going to rain tomorrow, such and such, believes that, the election's going to be on the 12th of December. Everybody else, apart from a philosopher, would say, I think it's going to rain tomorrow, I think it's going to... So that's the sense. It's the sense that's sort of synonymous with the normal word thinks. And it's meant to be entirely neutral because it doesn't tell you whether it's true or false. Some beliefs are true, some are false. It doesn't tell whether it's justified, some are justified. I've got justified belief that the election's going to be 12th of December. I've got an unjustified belief that, the monster Reagan Looney Party is going to win it or something like that. So it's meant to be entirely neutral. And the reason I don't use knowledge is that's meant to be a really sort of substantial honorific. That's meant to be, something's knowledge if it has all the great properties. The thing's got to be true, it's got to be super justified, it's got to be done in, created. You've got to come by the knowledge in this really nice way. So I was trying to use belief just as an entirely, neutral way. It just means that the person has a kind of affirmative cognitive state towards the thing. They think it. They think it's true. That's what it means.
Yeah.
So that's a very bizarre idiolect of philosophers. It's true.
We've already got into the thorny business of language, so maybe we should turn to you, Nisha. You're a working poet. Why would a poet be sympathetic to the idea of the occult?
So I was thinking. Well, first of all, so the publisher Ignota that Shahidha already mentioned, so they published my book, and the first book that they published was called Spells, and it's an anthology of 21st century occult poetry, and I think they offer actually quite a good, or the editors Rebecca Tomas and Sarah Shin offer a kind of useful definition for starting to think about this, which is about people who are trying to use language in such a way that it might influence the universe. And the influence they're thinking about is about both personal transformation but also social justice. And so I was thinking about, and they talk about spell poems. And I was thinking about this kind of phrase, spell poem. And so I tend to, as a poet and just geek, always go to the dictionary. I'm still obsessed with definitions and etymologies, and so spells, like some of the kind of most basic definitions, are just using the right words in the right order, and that is also a sort of a definition of poetry that I think Coleridge used to describe poetry. So it's something about using words, the right words in the right order, but it's also to try and make something happen. And then so there's some, this is an ongoing debate, does poetry make anything happen in the world? And the levels on which it makes things happen, I think, are really important to think about, because it could be just on an individual level, it might just change your mood. But I do also believe in sort of individual, collective possibilities for what poetry can do. So, and also this isn't, so the recent anthology might suggest it's like a recent turn, but it's not at all a recent turn. It's kind of harking back to these sort of age-old, I'm not a historian, I'm going to be very vague, these age-old notions of what the relationships are between poetry and myth and poets and visionaries and priests, people who conduct rituals and ceremonial spaces by means of language, create sacred spaces by means of language, and help guide people through transformations. And also, if you haven't seen it, the William Blake exhibition at the Tate Britain is another kind of amazing example of a poet visionary. So it's not at all a new thing. I think it's manifesting in new ways, and maybe when we're going to talk a bit later about how it's the kind of the occult in contemporary culture. I would say that I use the term occult very loosely and bringing in all sorts of different practices and traditions, and I think that is a reflection of how it's used at the moment, where people might be interested in saying mantras and doing meditation, as well as lighting different kinds of herbs, as well as reading tarot, a spread of tarot. And there is something, I mean, there are positives and negatives about this, but there is something very kind of diverse, let's say, about the range of practices that people are using who think about the occult right now. And yeah, I guess, like, with regards to my own practices, my research started off being I wanted to learn Sanskrit. And when I decided I wanted to learn Sanskrit, I wanted to think about what texts I could translate. And so I was reading lots and lots, and I knew I wanted to translate sacred texts, and also because those were some of the earliest texts in Sanskrit. And I've always been drawn to goddesses. I think it started off maybe as some sort of maybe feminist idea about seeing a divine feminine, which wasn't necessarily around in, like, growing up in Glasgow, and my parents weren't religious. So yeah, I started looking into these goddesses, and I found this group of, this is maybe where the sort of spooky and gory comes in, because I found this group of Tantric Hindu goddesses, although some of them exist also in Tantric Buddhist traditions, called the Mahavidyas, and they are the great wisdom goddesses, and they are some of the most bizarre goddesses you would ever see. So I write about all of them. The one who's I'm most taken with is called Chinnamasta, and she's actually a Hindu and Buddhist goddess. But Chinnamasta is she who cuts off her own head to feed herself and her loved ones. So in iconography, she's always shown with these 3 fountains of blood coming out of her neck. And so it's very gory. But it's heavily symbolic and metaphorical, and it's all about love as self-sacrifice and giving yourself up to kind of feed and care for others. So I was translating these goddesses, and I also then became really interested when I was looking at the goddesses about how they are worshipped and what sorts of ritual traditions are associated with them. And I was thinking about that in terms of poetic practices. So again, I didn't really see there being kind of vast differences between ritual practices and poetic practices, because often it would be sort of setting up rules or systems and thinking about how to process different kinds of information or experiences, how to structure thought. And yeah, so and poetry, I always think of poetry readings as being something like a ceremonial space, where you're kind of, well, I won't say more about it.
What does that mean we should encourage you to read? That sounds right, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I usually stand, but I'll sit.
I think that mic is on.
Oh, okay.
If you want to.
Okay, thank you.
Is that okay?
I have I've got a 2-minute. I think it's a 2-minute poem, which kind of goes through some of my ideas about the connections between tantric ritual and poetic practices. So I can.
Sure. Would you like the glass of water? Are you okay?
Oh,
a 2-minute poem. Need some libations.
Thank you. Ritual steps for a tantric poetics. This is the way to north, the honey love of air. Poetry and myth lick your ears. This is the way to northeast, the drunk eyes of air fire,
Forgetting, you slip into dialect. This is the way to east, the hurting hold of fire. Your tongue becomes strange to you. This is the way to southeast, the sad smoke of fire water. Soak your loneliness in cold water. This is the way to south, the blood sacrifice of water. Dance on their backs as they copulate. This is the way to southwest, the inner heat of water, earth. Knowledge cauterizes. This is the way to west, the earth body of earth. Right the flash before subjectivity. This is the way to northwest, the 3 points of earth, air. Consider geometrical process. This is the way to above, the safe crossing off above, etymology as your ladder. This is the way to below, the dead time off below. Your fear, the words mean nothing. Come away from north. Assume the contemporary. You have access to more words than you are using. Come away from northeast. Try on as many voices as you like. Impressions imply remaking. Come away from east. Your bones, your blood vessels, your eyelashes. How astonishing. Astonishing. Come away from southeast. The confessional sounds you make in the bath. You are so much more than feeling. Come away from south. The obscure narratives you rely on. Start again with blood and iron. Come away from southwest. Your arms are scarred with procedure. You were wrong about sealed containers. Come away from west. Before essentialism smothers you, get out, get out, get out. Come away from northwest. The constraints you have reasoned yourself into. Stare at flowers until something happens. Come away from above, the warmth of academic contexts, unless you can sweat it out. Come away from below, extending words to the breaking. The charm has wound down. Thank you, yes. Thank you so much. It's a really lovely thing to have in the middle of one of our events. I wonder if I can pick up on the gory goddess and the feminist strand that you started to draw out, and perhaps Lauren, you might have something to say to this too, and Richard too, of course. But is it trite to try to understand the occult in relationship to particular, manifestations of feminist or resistance to patriarchal logic? Is that, I think perhaps it's a cliche to talk about witchcraft in relationship to feminism, but is there a historic relationship, and how do you understand it in the contemporary Nisha?
You go first. Well, I think that there are so many different ways to answer. One of the things I found striking when I was doing my research into the Tantric goddesses, I rely completely upon a Sanskrit English dictionary, and I use one that was compiled by a 19th century lexicographer, Sir Monier Williams, and I have a very intimate relationship with him now, and I got to know him really well through constantly referring to the dictionary. And one of the interesting things about him, so he was the Bowdoin Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford, and he came to that position not just because of his proficiency with Sanskrit, but also because of his, he was an evangelical Christian. And he says very explicitly in the preface to the dictionary that it's been compiled to aid in the conversion of the natives of India. So it was a sort of an instrument for missionaries to use to, to translate Christian texts into Sanskrit. And he's one of the things about when I was I looked up just to see out of interest, when does he use the word occult in his definitions? And it's always for tantric practices. And so things like using mystical diagrams or things like using hand gestures. And in terms of goddess worship as well. He was most appalled. He wasn't actually, quite liked lots of things about Indian culture and religious traditions. He really didn't like goddess worship. He found that particularly abhorrent. And I always found that really intriguing and interesting. Why was he so repulsed? I got the feeling he was repulsed. So, and then also, I guess the other thing I was just going over the book Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici, who's a Marxist feminist, and it's called, I think, Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation. And one of the things, I feel very inadequate at summarizing it, but it talks about the kind of the transition in Europe from feudalism to capitalism, and it sort of makes these links between the ways in which land became enclosed in terms of private property, and also women's bodies. And so women who previously had been doing all sorts of other kinds of work became necessary mainly for the production and reproduction of labourers, of workers. And so this is a kind of, it wasn't important, and in fact it was actively dangerous for women to have particular kinds of knowledge relating to their own bodies, like herbal knowledge or knowledge about contraception or abortions, and lots of other kinds of things. And that was sort of completely counter to the aims and logics of capitalism. And she kind of, I think historically there is maybe some contention about some of her facts, but the narrative, I think, is really persuasive, and thinking about this how kind of women became alienated from their own bodies, and as people became alienated from the land that they'd previously been able to access and use.
Yeah, I think it's a question about the gendering of the occult. So Richard and Lauren, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
So I'll talk about the gendering of the occult, and then we'll go back to witchcraft, if we may. So one of the ways that the occult is most clearly gendered is when it is talked about as superstition, as irrational. And one of the things that I was very interested when Richard referred to half the people might seem irrational, and I wondered if he was referring to women. And
I wasn't, but I can see.
Because historically that is what you get, right? Particularly with Enlightenment philosophers, to be very crass about it, that reason is masculine and superstition is feminine. Because women, because of their physiology, they're more subject to the powers of the imagination. They're softer in literal ways as well as figurative ways, so they are by definition more irrational, and there's a value judgment here, right? That means they can't do certain things. So this is this is a nice kind of before and after story. So before the Enlightenment, women can be as rational as men. There's more of a spectrum, but what the Enlightenment does is it naturalizes the human body so that women, by definition, are less rational, and men are, by definition, more rational. And this is one of these before and after stories. And witchcraft also lends itself to these various before and after stories. And here is where, in many ways, the real story is not that there were powerful witches and women lost that knowledge. It was taken away from them by men. We don't have a lot of historical evidence to demonstrate that. But what's really interesting is that around 1900, all sorts of scholarly people decided that was the story.
Right.
And so why did they decide that was the story? And what power does that story have, which is then picked up by feminists through the 20th century, who talk about the loss of female knowledge and the loss of female power in the name of feminism. And so part of the problem is that us killjoy historians come in and say, well, that's not true. There's no evidence about that, but we're still feminists.
Yeah.
And we still think women are powerful, just not in that narrative that you have told.
Yeah. But perhaps that brings me to my next question, and I promise I will turn to the audience soon, is just that why, despite the evidence, and I know we've been questioning evidence, why, despite the evidence, would you believe in the occult? What do you get from it? Richard, perhaps you could have a go at that.
Gosh, I suppose it's important to distinguish between cases where there was just no evidence one way or the other, where you were just, there hadn't been huge amount of evidence accumulated, and then, of course, essentially, this is why I was asking Lauren about the sort of continuity of what we think of as kind of scientific or medical sort of investigation. It looks like it was just people were dealing with a situation where there wasn't a kind of really seriously well confirmed sort of theory that kind of where a huge amount of evidence had been accumulated for it, and it sort of covered everything, and people could. In that case, it looks like you could believe it because, for the reasons you might believe any of the other things. And in a way, you were sort of believing certain things that look like the best scientific theory of the time to some extent. Why you would believe it, I think, in a period where, at least believe in its efficacy, believe in the efficacy of some sort of hidden powers when there's a very well-supported theory about how those powers actually work that's sort of got a lot of them. Why you might believe it then? I don't think this is a particularly new or original point, but there's a sense in which a lot of the kind of scientific image that we now have of the world, and particularly the sort of image that where, if not at the end of science, we've now got theories that cover just vastly more of the world than we might have done at the previous time. One thing about that is people talk about it sort of disenchanting the world, and I think you talked about this sort of earlier on, that in a sense some beliefs in sort of hidden powers and hidden forces that govern some of the things around us is some sort of attempt to re-enchant the world, to sort of still to give it some mystery that people... I think I've always felt this is just a mistake, that people sort of think that the scientific images, or the images that science gives us of the world is somehow disenchanted, they somehow lack enchantment. It seems to me, looking at kind of scientific vision of the world, it looks way more enchanted to me and way more interesting and wonderful and sort of awe-inspiring to me than any of actually the sort of alternative theories that they overturned. I mean, some of the kind of current scientific theories just look totally remarkable to me. But I do suspect for some people who don't find those theories wonder-inducing, that sort of turning to other sorts of, or thinking that there are other hidden forces around that you could manipulate in various ways might be one way of going with it.
Do you want to have the bat of that question, or do you want to escape?
I would be happy to, I'll try to be brief, I agree with all of that, and I think that's a really nice way of accounting for any given person's way of understanding what is going on with this question about enchantment, evidence, and the occult. I have a kind of non-answer, but I actually think it's really important to pay attention to that one of the reasons why people find the occult appealing is not about the logic or lack of logic of it, but it's a social answer. And there are communities of people who share ideas, right? Ideas and practices that one signs up to. And so there are moments in history where people who are part of an occult group, which means both secret and having control of secret powers, that's something that one wants to do. And so you can't separate out the philosophical from the social, because that's by definition setting yourself socially apart. In some cases, it's critics who label those people as occult, but as with all things that critics posit, then if you embrace that category, you can use it to your advantage. So I think that's where this comes up against the issue with why there is so much questioning of evidence and of facts these days.
Yeah.
Because actually, if you're part of a group of people who has a set of ideas that make sense to you, you are bolstered by each other. It's a social phenomenon. It's not about that one person's set of ideas, because no one person just has a set of ideas.
Yeah, that's a great response. Shall I hand over to the audience? Oh, I can see so many questions. So we have a mic. Let's get... so the jumper at the front, in the black and white jumper next to you, this black and white jumper there. So that question first, and then we'll get that question there, and then that question there. So first, you had your hand up, didn't you? Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk.
Can you hold the mic right up to your mouth?
Like this? Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to ask more. You mentioned the social appeal of occult groups and why people would join for that aspect. I wondered if you could elaborate more on kind of the rituals of occults, because I feel like with rituals you can kind of not believe in that particular ritual but then still be committed to doing that particular practice right and correctly. So I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how that kind of relates to the social aspect of occult groups.
Let's get the other two questions in as well. That one there.
Hello, my name is Austin Hayes.
Could you hold the mic right up to your mouth?
Hello, my name is Austin Hayes. I'm a postgrad from City ILS, and my question, so when we look at a belief in occultism, to be empathetic for momentous familiarities, this is comprised of the work Richard and Lauren talked about, Richard's belief, or evidence for belief, and Lauren's work in occultism. And when we look to be empathetic for momentous familiarities, with those controls, we hope to be able to identify familiarities between physics and physical properties. And what evidence could we take from occultism, or when we're trying to try to see in between those physics and physical properties? What's maybe like an investigative way to go about peering into that?
Okay, great, thank you. So a question about physics and physical properties, and the question there. We'll do our best to try and answer each of them, but I'm going to try and squeeze as many questions as possible.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about God and magic. Exactly 12 years ago, I was studying at UCL. And when the time for me to leave, I need to sort out the materials to go to be with me. And actually, I'm from China, work for the Chinese Communist Party, including is a booklet from the St. Paul's. When I was visiting the St. Paul's, a booklet. And then, yes, I'm living in a studio, a kitchen room and a bedroom. Then when I sort out the materials and I brought the materials I need to bring with me to the bedroom. I even ranked order. But the moment that I leave, I couldn't find the booklet, from the St. Paul's. I searched everything about half an hour. Then I almost give up. Then an idea came to me. I said that, must be the God. Tell me something. Because for a communist, it is impossible for me to believe in God. Then I said, he must be telling me I'm here. So I said that, yes, my God. Yes, I said, my God, if you are here, let me see the booklet. Must be the other room. Then I go back to the other room. Actually, the booklet was there. Was there. And then after that, I myself stayed there for about half an hour. I didn't know what to say. And then even after that, I couldn't believe there's a God. I said that, okay, there's a list of events. I said, every event is A or B. I said that if there's three events, every event is A, I will believe there's a God. Actually, the three events every time is A. So it puzzled me for 12 years. I don't know the answer. I asked the panel, please tell me if there's a God. Thank you.
Richard. No, thank you. That's just such a brilliant question. 3 questions. You can take any of them. The first one was about social rituals, wasn't it? Which I think is a really good question. The second one was about what can we take from the occult and the relationship between physics and physical. And the third... I think that is about the inexplicable and the re-enchantment of the forum for philosophy. But we'll do our best, sir. So, any takers? I mean, I think you could have a go at the social rituals, perhaps. That's perhaps a manageable.
But I'm going to have a go at the third one first.
Great.
Brilliant. Just to say, is there a God? And I mean, and again, I have a kind of non-answer. The testing of God, show me that you are here, has a long history, right? And that itself is contentious because faith is not testing God, right? And again, I give you, I mean, I have no religion. I was literally raised with no religion, but I study the Christian world. So I, by default, understand quite a bit of Christian theology. And so that question of needing the evidence is itself, for theologians, highly problematic. But you could probably go and find any number, if we went back to the 17th century, any number of occult practitioners who, first of all, for them, by definition, there was a God, and the spirits were everywhere. And at the same time, they could show you those workings, because that's what they were messing with in all of their activities. So it's not a real answer, but it's to say you're not alone and in your desire. You're also not alone in your tendency to lose things, but you're not alone in your desire to explain them in terms of using them to test the divine workings in the natural world, which relates to the question, if I understood it correctly, about what does it mean to go through the motions, right, of rituals? Was that the thrust of it? And again, I think if we look at the way people behave as groups, not as individuals, and we have this kind of fixation on explaining action in terms of the individual, because we're fixated on that as the unit, I don't think individuals do anything. I think families, communities, friends, cohorts of all sorts, that is the unit. We are social beings. And so it doesn't mean, so for an example from my work is that it's very important that I don't think that everybody who went and consulted the astrologer believed in astrology. They just went to the astrologer. And it's the same thing as saying every time you take an aspirin, are you fully taking on board, are you interrogating the way that affects the analgesic properties on your body? No, you're just taking an aspirin. You're just going through the motions because you want the effects. And you might do a series of other things like have a nap, right? And we might consider one a ritual and the other not, but they're actually the same. So again, everything I'm saying is dispersing with the occult as a category, but that's because I do think the world is enchanted, exactly as Richard was saying. And I wish that we could hold on to that and keep the notion of science at bay.
Any other takers for the questions?
I was going to say the one about the investigating the occult. What sort of evidence we might have for it? Sorry. Yeah, so I mean, I think in a way, I suppose this comes back, and I think actually this also relates to the question, not so much about the ritual, but about the sort of social processes. This sort of point that what sort of evidence you think is going to be the right, or how you go about investigating a particular occult or a particular claim within the occult of a particular hidden process. I take it's just going to be particular to that process. Some of them. Because in a lot of ways, a lot of occult processes, I mean, this already came up with something Lauren said, is our claims about action at a distance. And actually, there are things within the sort of completely traditional orthodox scientific firmament that are action at a distance, Newtonian laws, but also even within, at least certain interpretations within quantum mechanics, you have this thing that Einstein calls spooky action at a distance. I mean, his whole point about this a particular sort of experiment that he and his co-authors described was exactly to claim that quantum mechanics has this bizarre consequence, that there must be this sort of particular thing he calls spooky action at a distance, and he thinks that's meant to be an objection to it. So I suppose what I was thinking was that in fact, a lot of the sorts of things that you might investigate in the occult, you would investigate in just exactly the same way as you would investigate any other sort of scientific claim. Because in a lot of ways, in type, they're not so different. I mean, sort of people who might believe in one may not believe in the others and so on. But the sort of claim they're claims about the regularity of a particular remedy at bringing about a particular effect. And we can do those sorts of experiments reasonably straightforwardly. I mean, one thing which hasn't come up actually so much, but something that some philosophers actually, again, I guess coming back to the Karl Popper stuff, worry about with certain sorts of, which would include certain occult beliefs that invoke personal agents like demons or angels or so on, is that there's a certain sense in which they're unfalsifiable, that you could never really do a test that would test them because the agency by which this thing is supposed to occur is through an intelligent being which makes certain decisions. And so if you went along to your magician and asked them to sort of harm someone to harm one of your enemies, and they claimed they were going to do that by sort of by petitioning a demon to do some bad thing to them, if it didn't work, they could just say, oh well, the demon decided not to cooperate this time, or you weren't in the demon's good books this time, or the demon didn't take the particular offering we put out. So there's a certain sense in which you could never kind of get a false test result for certain sorts of beliefs, and that's how some people want to carve up the kind of scientific versus non-scientific. So I think that's one worry to have about it.
Or should I take more questions? Yeah. Okay, let's take another very quick round. Wave at me if there are questions. So there's a question at the very back there, one here in the middle, and then the one there. I'm sorry if I haven't got to you. Yes, that's you.
Hi, thank you. So I had a question about the senses and how they're used to, we could say, like, perceive proof of existence of things. So would you say that there are certain senses that are more convincing in terms of just like perceiving whether things are actually there or not? And if so, what are the implications in terms of determining what is rational or irrational and what is supernatural or yeah, whatever?
Great, lovely. Good, quick questions.
Yes. My question is quite similar. Does the panel think that belief in the occult really depends on experience and whether people are able to have what's called ESP, extrasensory perception?
Great.
Which means, for example, if there's a ghost somewhere, some people can see it and some people can't. And if those people can't, then they won't have those experiences and therefore won't believe in the occult.
Thank you. And that one.
Yeah, I just wondered, to Richard's question about kind of investigating the occult, to what extent we might have radically different standards for investigating certain beliefs. So, for instance, like the benefits of the welfare state versus more occult-like beliefs. So potentially like how my consciousness relates to the consciousness of other beings. And that both those different standards might coexist as kind of very different layers, but existing at the same time.
Great, thank you. We have to have very quick answers, so perhaps you can pick a question if you would like to. Nisha, I feel like I want to encourage you to answer.
I like the question about ESP, and I was just thinking that I've been reading lots of Ursula Le Guin lately, a sci-fi writer, and who kind of initially takes a sort of anthropological approach to her science fiction. But one of the things that she is consistent throughout is that humans will evolve to be able to mind speak. So kind of telepathic communication. So that's something. So, and I find it really interesting and appealing as well. And I was thinking about attunement. So and actually this relates to the sound as well. Just like a level of attunement, and that some people are more sensitive than others to different kinds of things, whether that's just like insects or germs or like particular high-pitched sounds, or, and I do think I'm not particularly skeptic, and I don't really rule anything out. But I think that I don't know about ESP, but I definitely believe in different levels of attunement to the surrounding world. That's it.
Great, thank you. Lauren, Richard?
I think I've said enough. They're great questions, but I do feel I've said
Richard? Oh, well, that means, I think that means that we've run out of time, but you can telepathically communicate your questions to our panellists, and they will do their best to reciprocate. But will you be sensitive enough? That is the question. If you would like to commune with Nisha more, her book is actually outside, and we strongly recommend that you go have a look at it and perhaps buy it. And Nisha, will you sign some of them? Will you be? Yeah, that would be lovely. And thank you so much for joining us. See you at the next one. Have a happy Halloween.